I never thought a single letter could turn my life upside down. But that's exactly what happened the day I opened the envelope from the HOA and read the words that made my blood run cold. Claiming they had development rights to the land my family had owned for generations. Land I had grown up running through, building forts in the trees and dreaming of the home I would one day put there. And at first I thought it was a mistake, a bureaucratic mix-up that would be quickly corrected. But then I started noticing the surveyors, the stakes in the ground, the crews measuring and mapping every inch of what I considered mine, and my heart sank with every step they took closer to destroying the fields and the woods that held so many memories. And I realized this was not a mistake. It was a deliberate move. A takeover of the place that had been ours for decades, and panic and anger collided inside me in ways I hadn't expected, because I had always been a calm person. Someone who believed that fairness and reason could solve anything. But this felt like a violation of everything I had known and loved. And as I walked the property line that evening, I saw the first bulldozer in the distance, digging trenches where my wildflowers used to grow, and I felt a mixture of fear, helplessness, and an unexpected surge of determination, because I knew that if I reacted too quickly, I could lose everything, but if I waited, watched, and learned, I might find a way to turn the situation around. And the thought of letting them build while I gathered proof and prepared my plan made my stomach churn with both dread and excitement, because I understood that patience could be more powerful than anger, and that the people who thought they were in control had no idea they were stepping into a trap they would never see coming. And in the days that followed, I met the neighbors who had already been caught up in this chaos, some whispering behind their fences, curious and envious, others shaking their heads in disbelief, warning me that I couldn't win against the HOA, that their lawyers and their authority were too strong for one person to fight, and their words made me doubt myself, made me question whether I was crazy to think I could outmaneuver a system built to crush anyone who dared to challenge it. But I couldn't give up, I couldn't let fear dictate my choices, and every morning I woke to see the crews working, to hear the roar of machines tearing up the land, to smell the dust and see the footprints where trees had once stood. And I made a silent promise to myself that I would not only reclaim my land, I would do it in a way that no one would forget, that I would show them that arrogance and power could be undone by strategy, patience, and knowledge. And as I began documenting everything, taking photographs of every misstep, every corner cut, every sign of negligence, I felt a strange calmness settle over me, a clarity that I hadn't known before, because in the midst of this chaos I was discovering a side of myself I didn't know existed, a side that was willing to wait, willing to endure, willing to watch the destruction unfold while secretly planning a reversal so complete that the people who had laughed at me, dismissed me, and ignored my rights would have no choice but to face the consequences. And as the weeks went on, I started noticing patterns, the small errors in paperwork, the minor violations of construction codes, the oversteps in their own rules, and each one felt like a tiny victory, a reminder that their confidence was their weakness, and that every step they took thinking they were advancing their agenda was actually building the evidence I needed to reclaim what was mine. And even though at night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, haunted by the thought of losing everything, I also felt a growing sense of control, because I understood that this was no longer just about property, it was about reclaiming dignity, asserting power, and proving to myself that I could turn a desperate situation into a triumph. And in those quiet moments I pictured the final scene, the day I would step into the courtroom and reveal the truth, the shock and disbelief on their faces, the sense of justice finally being served, and that vision kept me steady, kept me moving forward even as the machinery tore up my childhood fields and the neighbors gossiped and shook their heads, because I knew that the story of this land, my land, would not end in defeat. It would end in a victory built on careful observation, calculated patience, and unwavering determination. And with every passing day I grew more resolved, more strategic, and more certain that the people who thought they had power over me had no idea that I had already begun writing the script that would flip everything in my favor. The next morning, I woke to the familiar roar of machinery, but this time it felt different, heavier, as if the sound carried the weight of every memory I had ever associated with that land. And as I stepped outside, the sight that greeted me made my chest tighten because the crews had advanced further than I expected. Bulldozing past the old stone fence I remembered my father building, cutting into the heart of the fields I had wandered as a child, and as I watched from the edge of the property, notebook and camera in hand, I realized that this was no longer a distant threat. This was a full-blown invasion of everything I held dear, and the HOA seemed oblivious to the fact that their arrogance was my opportunity. That every careless step they took, every violation of rules, every hastily signed permit, was giving me leverage I had only just begun to collect, but still the emotional strain was immense, because it wasn't just property, it was my history, my identity, the memories of laughter and freedom that had filled those open spaces, and with each passing day I had to convince myself not to yell, not to confront the foreman, not to make the mistake of showing desperation, because I knew that any hint of weakness would play right into their hands and ruin the strategy one was slowly building. So instead I observed, noting the errors, the permits filed late, the miscommunications between surveyors, the corners they cut in construction, all of which I photographed meticulously, labeling each image, creating a record that would eventually become undeniable proof. And yet the closer they came to finishing the foundations, the harder it became to control my emotions, because standing there as trees fell and earth was torn apart, I felt grief so sharp it nearly knocked me off my feet. And in those moments I had to remind myself that I wasn't powerless, that letting them build was not surrender, but a deliberate choice, a baited trap that would make their eventual downfall even more devastating. And while the neighbors started to murmur and gossip, some expressing pity, others incredulity at my apparent inaction, I remained calm on the surface, because I knew they couldn't understand what I was doing, couldn't see the layers of preparation and observation that were taking place quietly, invisibly, as I cataloged every misstep and documented every inconsistency. And in the evenings, when the crews left and silence returned, I walked the perimeter of my land, inspecting every stake, every corner, imagining how I would present each piece of evidence in court, envisioning the shock on the faces of the HOA board members when they realized that I had not only tolerated their intrusion, but used it to build the strongest possible case against them. And yet, despite this clarity, there were nights when doubt crept in, nights when I questioned whether patience alone could counter the sheer scale of what they were attempting. 96 homes rising like a forest of steel and wood on my land, a visual assault on everything I cherished, and during those restless nights I thought about the lawyers I would need, the documents I had to retrieve, the rules and regulations I had to study until I knew them better than anyone in the HOA, and every morning I faced the same growing, gut-wrenching chaos, feeling both the adrenaline of a battle I was orchestrating and the weight of near despair at how quickly my land was disappearing under machinery and progress. And yet in that tension, that unbearable mixture of anxiety and focus, a clarity emerged, a realization that the HOA's confidence was their vulnerability, that every assumption they made about my supposed weakness would be turned against them, and with each passing day, I began to anticipate their moves, to predict the shortcuts they would take, the corners they would ignore, the disputes among themselves over permits and property lines, because no organization this large could move with perfect coordination, and every flaw became a building block for my strategy. And as the weeks wore on, the tension escalated further when I discovered that some of the homeowners in nearby developments were already complaining about the work, the noise, and the encroachment on shared easements, creating cracks in the HOA's apparent unity, which I documented carefully, knowing that every complaint could be leveraged, every grievance noted, every oversight preserved in my growing collection of evidence. And while outwardly I continued to act like a passive observer, inside I felt the pressure mounting, a tight knot of anger, anxiety, and anticipation, because I knew that patience was essential, but so was timing, and if I moved too early, all my planning would be wasted. Yet if I waited too long, the emotional cost of watching my land transformed into a suburban development could break me, and the balancing act became almost unbearable, walking the line between visible calm and hidden strategy. And during this time, I also learned more about the people I was up against, the personalities on the HOA board, the overconfidence of the foreman, the arrogance of the contractors who believed they were untouchable, and understanding them became part of the plan, because the more I knew about their motivations and weaknesses, the better I could anticipate mistakes and use them to my advantage. And as the structures took shape, walls rising and streets appearing where my past once lay, I began imagining the day I would reveal my hand, how the courtroom would feel, the hush that would descend as the evidence stacked in my favor, and how their smug confidence would crumble, leaving them exposed, humiliated, and powerless. And in that mental rehearsal I found both comfort and strength, because while the tension in the present was nearly unbearable, I could see the larger picture forming, the eventual victory I was carefully crafting in silence, knowing that every sleepless night, every pang of helplessness, every moment of watching my memories replaced with concrete and wood, was another step toward the moment when I would finally turn the tables and reclaim not just my land, but my sense of justice, control, and dignity, and that vision, fragile and distant as it seemed at times, became the force that kept me moving, observing, documenting, and enduring, knowing that the real battle was not in the noise and chaos outside, but in the quiet, calculated patience that would allow me to emerge from this storm stronger than ever. The days blurred together as the construction advanced, each morning bringing new walls, new foundations, and new reminders that the land I had loved since childhood was being transformed by people who had no right to touch it, and the tension I had carried quietly for weeks began to manifest in every aspect of my life, a constant undercurrent of anxiety and rage that I could neither ignore nor let anyone see, because the HOA thrived on believing they had me cornered, that their confidence was unshakable, and yet beneath their bravado I could sense cracks forming, small disagreements over permits, conflicting claims about easements, and the subtle panic that came from realizing that their paperwork was not as flawless as they had assumed. And one afternoon, while reviewing the latest survey maps, I noticed a glaring discrepancy, a section of land that had been recorded as transferred to them without the proper signatures, and that tiny error became a beacon of hope, proof that their sense of invincibility was unfounded. And as I delved deeper, I discovered more mistakes, improperly filed notices, skipped inspections, and overlooked regulations, each one a thread I could pull to unravel their entire plan. But the emotional stakes escalated when one of the foremen, a smug man who seemed to take pleasure in asserting control over my property, confronted me directly, telling me in no uncertain terms that I had no authority here, that the land was theirs to use, and for the first time I felt the sharp edge of fear cut through my careful composure, the reality of what they were doing hitting me with full force, and yet that confrontation also lit a fire inside me, a determination to expose not only their arrogance but their recklessness, to make them accountable in a way they had never imagined. And in the evenings, when the machines quieted and the land was littered with the chaos of construction, I began speaking with neighbors who had witnessed errors and mismanagement, gathering statements, learning about conflicts within the HOA board, and realizing that while they projected unity, there were factions, disagreements, and rivalries that could be exploited if I approached them carefully, and the complexity of it all made my mind race, every decision feeling like walking a tightrope, balancing patience with action, observation with engagement, and strategy with the emotional toll of seeing my land systematically altered. And then one night, after a long day of photographing permits and noting violations, I noticed lights in the distance moving across my property, shadows that didn't belong, and I realized someone was tampering with the evidence I had been collecting, moving stakes, erasing markers, attempting to erase the mistakes they knew were their undoing, and the realization that they were aware, at least in part, of the trap I was setting, sent a chill down my spine, because now the game was personal, a battle of wits and will, and I could no longer treat it as a distant legal maneuver. It was a confrontation, silent but palpable, where every move mattered, and in that moment I understood that the stakes were higher than I had imagined, that this was not just about land, but about pride, power, and who could assert control under pressure, and the tension was compounded the next morning when a delivery of materials arrived at the wrong site, exposing further disorganization within the HOA's operations. A small victory that made me realize that no system, no matter how confident, is immune to error, and I began to exploit these weaknesses subtly, asking questions, documenting responses, noting inconsistencies, and planting seeds that would later grow into undeniable evidence. And the more I learned, the more I understood how deeply personal this conflict had become, because the land was not just a property dispute, it was a legacy, a symbol of my family's history, and a test of my resilience and cunning. And as I observed the crews arguing among themselves, the foremen dismissing their own errors, and the board members scrambling to cover mistakes that could no longer be ignored, I felt a mix of triumph and anxiety, knowing that one wrong move on my part could ruin everything, but also knowing that the emotional intensity one felt was fueling my focus, sharpening my awareness, and reinforcing my commitment to see this through. And then the real twist came when I discovered that a few of the homeowners whose properties were adjacent to mine had begun questioning the legality of the HOA's actions, noticing encroachments and irregularities in the construction, and that opened a door I hadn't anticipated, because now allies existed where I thought only opposition remained, and carefully, I began to cultivate these relationships, collecting testimonies, documenting grievances, and preparing a network of support that would amplify the impact of my eventual case. And all the while, the emotional pressure mounted, the anger at what had been done to my land and the anxiety about whether my careful plan would hold clashing with the growing sense of control and purpose, and I felt a transformation within myself, a shift from passive observer to active strategist, someone who understood that the most powerful victories often required endurance, patience, and the ability to anticipate the moves of those who believed they were untouchable. And in the middle of this struggle, I faced moments of doubt, questioning whether the risk I was taking, allowing them to build so close to completion, was too great, whether I could live with the destruction I had watched unfold if the legal battle failed. And yet even in those moments of fear, the clarity of my strategy prevailed, reminding me that every error they made, every miscalculation, every moment of overconfidence was building the foundation of my eventual triumph. And the more intense the conflict became, the more personal it felt, until the entire situation was no longer just a fight over property. It was a battle for justice, for legacy, and for proving that knowledge, patience, and determination could overcome arrogance and power. And as I watched the sun set behind the skeletal frames of the homes being built on what had once been my sanctuary, I realized that the real war had only just begun, that every heartbeat of anxiety and hope, every moment of tension and calculation, was bringing me closer to the day when I would not only reclaim what was mine but turn the arrogance of the HOA into a spectacle of accountability they would never forget. The morning started like any other, with the low rumble of machinery echoing across my land. But this day felt different, charged with an energy I couldn't yet define, and as I walked the property line, notebook in hand, I noticed a delivery truck that shouldn't have been there, carrying materials that didn't match the plans. The HOA had filed, and curiosity mixed with a pulse of adrenaline as I approached, realizing almost immediately that someone had made a critical mistake. A mistake so significant it could unravel the entire project if leveraged correctly, and my heart raced as I examined the documents accompanying the shipment, noticing missing permits, misfiled approvals, and signatures that didn't match, errors that should never have happened in such a carefully controlled environment. Yet there they were, glaring and undeniable, and in that moment I felt a surge of vindication, a sense that all my patience, all the sleepless nights spent documenting, observing, and preparing, were about to pay off. But before I could savor it, I caught movement at the far edge of the property, a familiar figure slipping behind the new foundation walls, and my pulse quickened, because I realized someone from the HOA had come to check on their own errors, perhaps suspicious of my activity. And suddenly the stakes became intensely personal, because this wasn't just about mistakes anymore. It was about me being discovered, about my careful plan being exposed, and I ducked behind a tree, my mind racing to anticipate the next move, knowing that any confrontation could either ruin everything or escalate the situation in my favor. And as I observed, I noticed a flash of papers being stuffed into a briefcase, a hurried attempt to conceal evidence of their mismanagement. And the realization hit me like a punch to the stomach that they were aware of the risk, that they knew I had eyes on them, and that fear and adrenaline collided inside me, sharpening my focus and forcing every nerve in my body to align with the goal I had set for myself from the beginning, to reclaim my land, my family's legacy, and my sense of justice. And in that tension, a new idea formed, a strategy that could turn the situation completely around, because if I could obtain those documents, prove the errors, and show that they had acted in bad faith, I could not only halt the construction but also strengthen my case so decisively that no court could ignore it. And the thought of finally having the leverage I needed sent a thrill through me, tempered by the caution I had learned over weeks of observation, because one wrong move could ruin the advantage I had painstakingly built. And as I formulated the plan, I also felt the emotional weight of what this meant, the fear that had accompanied me through the destruction of my childhood fields, the frustration of watching crews build what I hadn't wanted, the anger at the arrogance of people who thought they could simply erase my rights. And now, at this turning point, those emotions transformed into a sharp, focused energy, a combination of outrage and cunning that gave me clarity, allowing me to see the perfect sequence of steps to execute. And I realized that this was the moment I had been preparing for all along, the day when patience, observation, and careful calculation could converge into decisive action. And as I moved carefully across the land, Avoiding the foreman and the workers, I began collecting the misplaced documents, photographing every error, and memorizing details that would make the HOA's confidence crumble. And in that process, I noticed something even more shocking, a subtle but critical violation in the foundation itself. A misalignment that could halt construction entirely if brought to light, and the gravity of the discovery hit me immediately because this single error could transform my strategy from cautious observation to an undeniable, game-changing advantage, and as I documented it, my mind raced through the possibilities, imagining the courtroom scene. The faces of the board members as they realized their arrogance had been their downfall, the shock, the scramble, the humiliation, and the victory that had been months in the making finally within reach. But even as excitement surged, I felt a pang of anxiety, because the HOA was unpredictable, capable of desperate moves when cornered, and I knew I had to act carefully, ensuring every step I took strengthened my position without alerting them to the full extent of my awareness. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the partially built homes, I felt a strange mix of triumph and fear, exhilaration and dread, because this turning point, this moment of leverage, changed everything, making the stakes higher than ever, more personal and more intense, because now it wasn't just about reclaiming land. It was about outsmarting people who had assumed they could control me, about proving that patience and intelligence could overcome arrogance and power. And as I packed up the collected evidence, I realized that from this day forward, the dynamics had shifted, the momentum had passed into my hands, and the story that had begun with fear and helplessness was transforming into one of strategy, calculated defiance, and the potential for an unprecedented victory. And in that charged moment, as I looked over the partially built homes and the land that had once felt lost, I felt the first real surge of hope and determination, knowing that the turning point had arrived, and everything from here on would be a test of timing, courage, and skill, a culmination of all the planning, patience, and emotional endurance that had carried me this far. And as I walked back to my car, clutching the evidence and feeling the weight of the day's discoveries, I understood that nothing would ever be the same, that the HOA's arrogance had created an opening I could exploit, and that the battle had escalated into a high-stakes confrontation where the outcome would depend not just on luck or law, but on every choice I made from this moment forward. And the tension was electric, the anticipation nearly unbearable, because I knew that the real struggle, the one that would define everything, was just beginning, and that the turning point I had reached would propel me toward the moment when all the carefully gathered pieces could be brought together to deliver justice, reclaim what was mine, and finally tip the balance in my favor in a way no one could have expected. The day of the court hearing arrived with a weight I had never felt before, a mixture of dread and anticipation that made my stomach twist as I drove past the rows of houses the HOA had built on my land, each one a reminder of what had been stolen and yet also a testament to the patience and careful planning that had brought me here. And as I stepped into the courtroom, the air thick with tension and the low murmur of onlookers, I saw the HOA board members sitting smugly at the table across from me, their confidence like a shield they thought would protect them from the storm I had been quietly assembling. And the moment the judge called the case, I felt every heartbeat amplify, knowing that everything I had documented, every misstep, every error, every small victory that had been meticulously recorded over months, now needed to be presented flawlessly, because this was the point of no return, the moment where all my strategy would be tested under the cold, impartial eyes of the law. And as my lawyer began to lay out the evidence, displaying the misfiled permits, the unauthorized constructions, the violations of codes and regulations, I watched the expressions of the board members change, the first flickers of doubt and unease crossing faces that had once been so full of arrogance, and a thrill surged through me, tempered by the awareness that the battle was far from over, that a single misstep in presentation or cross-examination could undo months of careful work. And as the lawyer detailed the errors in construction, the discrepancies in signatures, and the violations of procedural rules, murmurs rippled through the courtroom, some incredulous, some approving, and I could feel the weight of justice slowly tipping in my favor. And then came the moment that made my chest tighten with both fear and triumph, when the judge asked the HOA representatives to explain a particularly glaring misstep, a foundation that had been built without proper authorization. And as they scrambled to provide an answer, fumbling through documents and contradicting one another, I realized the trap I had set was working. that their overconfidence and carelessness had been their undoing, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the details of the violations were laid bare, the evidence irrefutable, and in that instant months of fear, anger, and anxiety exploded into a strange, overwhelming clarity, a sense that victory was within reach but still fragile, because the tension was electric, and every word, every glance, every reaction mattered. And when the judge finally began to speak, detailing how the deeds to the property had never legally transferred to the HOA and ordering that the land be returned to me, I felt a wave of relief and triumph so intense it nearly brought me to my knees, because it wasn't just the land that was reclaimed, it was my sense of control, my dignity, and my family's legacy. And as the gavel struck and the room erupted into whispers and shocked murmurs, I watched the HOA representatives slump in disbelief, their faces pale and their confident postures shattered, and the homeowners in the back exchanged astonished glances, some leaning forward, eyes wide, as if they had just witnessed a miracle, and the emotional intensity of that moment struck me fully, because all the months of observation, planning, and endurance had led to this singular point where patience and strategy had triumphed over arrogance and assumed power, and stepping outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter, yet charged with the awareness of what had just occurred, the knowledge that the consequences for the HOA were profound, that their mismanagement and overreach would be remembered and cited for years to come, and I felt a mixture of exhilaration and exhaustion, a release of tension so complete that tears threatened to fall as I looked across my land from a distance, seeing the half-built houses, the streets carved into my fields, and realizing that what had once felt like devastation was now a testament to resilience, patience, and cunning, and in the immediate aftermath, I began to receive messages from neighbors, some offering congratulations, others expressing disbelief at the outcome, and I understood that this was not just a personal victory. It was a signal to everyone that even powerful organizations could be held accountable, that arrogance had limits, and that careful observation and preparation could turn the most desperate situations into triumphs. And yet, even in that moment of victory, I felt a profound weight of responsibility, because the land I had fought so hard to reclaim was scarred by construction, altered in ways that would take time to heal, and I knew that decisions lay ahead, whether to restore it, sell it, or find a way to incorporate the new structures into a plan that honored the land and my family's history. And as I walked along the property line that evening, the sun low and warm on my face, I felt a strange mixture of closure and anticipation, because the climax of the legal battle was over. The immediate fallout had been intense and emotionally draining, but the story of my land, and the lessons learned through every mistake and every confrontation, would continue to shape my decisions, my sense of justice, and my understanding of power. And standing there, surveying the space that had once been threatened, I realized that the intensity of the climax had transformed me, that the fear, the anger, the suspense, and the strategic patience had forged a resolve I had never known before. And while the future was uncertain, one thing was clear: the turning of the tide in that courtroom had changed everything, and I finally understood that true victory was not just in reclaiming property. It was in reclaiming control, asserting justice, and proving to myself that even against overwhelming odds, patience, intelligence, and perseverance could overcome arrogance, fear, and assumed power. And as the shadows lengthened over the land, I felt the first real sense of peace, tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning of rebuilding, reflection, and making decisions that would honor everything that had been fought for, and the intensity of the moment, the climax, the fallout, and the lessons etched into every corner of that property would stay with me forever, a reminder that the hardest battles often produce the most profound victories. The weeks after the court ruling passed in a blur of relief, decision-making, and the quiet satisfaction of finally reclaiming what was mine. And as I walked the land that had once been threatened, I noticed the subtle changes brought by the construction. The neat streets and half-built homes standing like silent monuments to the conflict that had consumed my life for months. And I felt a strange mixture of grief, triumph, and responsibility, because victory had come at a cost. The fields of my childhood scarred and altered memories, replaced by foundations and frames. Yet in that same space, I sensed possibility, the chance to shape the land anew, to honor my family's history while moving forward with the clarity that had been forged in the fire of the struggle. And the neighbors who had once whispered and gossiped now approached me with cautious respect, offering congratulations or simply nodding in acknowledgement of what I had accomplished. And even some of the HOA members, humbled by their public defeat, seemed changed, quieter, more aware of the consequences of arrogance and the limits of assumed power. And as I spent more time reflecting, I realized that the conflict had taught me far more than any victory could alone. That patience, observation, and careful planning were not just strategies for land disputes, but principles I could carry into every part of my life. That endurance in the face of frustration and injustice revealed a strength I had underestimated within myself. And as I considered what to do with the property, the options stretched before me like uncharted territory, whether to restore the land entirely, integrate some of the structures into a plan that honored its history, or even sell portions while retaining the heart of what had been ours for generations. And I realized that each choice carried meaning beyond dollars or convenience, that every decision was a statement of who I was, how I had fought, and what I valued. And as I walked along the newly created streets, I imagined families moving into the homes, creating their own stories, unaware that their very presence had been preceded by a battle for justice, and I felt a mix of protectiveness, acceptance, and unexpected hope, because the land was no longer just mine. It was a symbol of resilience, a record of what patience, strategy, and courage could accomplish. And even as I reveled in the personal vindication of seeing the HOA humbled and the legal system affirming my rights, I also understood that the story of the land, like life itself, would continue to evolve, that challenges would arise, decisions would need to be made, and the lessons learned would remain vital guides. And I found myself reflecting on the emotional journey I had undergone. The fear, the anger, the sleepless nights, the anxiety of watching my memories altered, and how each of these had been transformed into a source of clarity, focus, and resilience. And in that reflection, I also acknowledged the complexity of relationships that had shifted as a result of the conflict, the neighbors who had judged, those who had quietly supported, the HOA members whose confidence had crumbled, and the knowledge that every interaction, every observation, and every moment of strategic patience had contributed to the final outcome. And as I stood at the highest point of the property, looking out over the land that had once felt lost, feeling the wind in my hair and the warmth of the sun on my face, I felt a profound sense of closure, a recognition that while the battle had been exhausting and emotionally fraught, it had also revealed the depths of my own perseverance, my capacity to endure, to strategize, and to triumph against forces that had seemed insurmountable. And in that moment, I made a silent promise to honor both the land and the lessons it had taught me, to carry forward the patience, insight, and courage that had made this victory possible. And as the day faded into evening, casting long shadows across the property, I realized that the story was complete in one sense, but still open in another, because the land, the lives it would touch, and the memory of the struggle would continue to evolve, serving as a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, careful observation, steadfast planning, and unwavering determination could not only reclaim what was lost but also create new possibilities. And as I turned to walk back toward the house, I felt a deep, abiding sense of peace, a quiet joy in the knowledge that I had faced the storm, endured it, and emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace the future, fully aware that the lessons learned here would guide me in every challenge yet to come, and that the land, once threatened, now stood as both a monument to resilience and a canvas for the life I would continue to build, one carefully chosen step at a time. Months had passed since the courtroom victory, yet the echoes of that intense battle lingered in every corner of my life, a reminder of how close I had come to losing not just land, but the sense of control and identity that had defined me for so long. And as I walked across the property now, the streets and houses still partially standing, some finished, some halted, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years, a quiet pride in the fact that patience, strategy, and observation had carried me through. But along with that pride came reflection on the personal toll the conflict had taken. The sleepless nights, the constant tension, the emotional highs and lows that had shaped me in ways I could barely articulate. And I realized that while the legal battle was over, the lessons remained, embedded in my approach to life, my understanding of power and my sense of resilience, because I had learned that even when the odds seemed insurmountable, careful planning and unwavering focus could turn desperation into opportunity, and that people who underestimated you, who relied on arrogance and assumed control, could be undone not through confrontation alone, but through patient, calculated action. And as I interacted with neighbors over the following months, some curious, some respectful, others still skeptical, I noticed a subtle shift in the community dynamic, an unspoken acknowledgement of what had occurred, a recognition that authority was not absolute and that oversight, diligence, and courage mattered more than bravado, and I felt a strange sense of responsibility, understanding that my victory was not just for me, but a reminder to everyone watching that vigilance, persistence, and integrity were forces to be reckoned with. And while some days I still wandered the property with a twinge of grief for the wild fields and old trees lost to construction, I also saw new possibilities, ways to restore parts of the land, to plant gardens, to create spaces that honored the history of the place while embracing what was possible in the future. And in those quiet moments, I reflected on my own growth, the transformation that had occurred within me, from fear and anxiety to confidence and clarity, realizing that the intense pressure had revealed a strength I hadn't fully recognized, and that the emotional endurance, the patience, and the strategic thinking I had cultivated were tools I would carry forward into every challenge yet to come. And I thought about the HOA members, once so confident, now humbled, and I understood that their overreach and arrogance had taught me as much as any legal victory, that power is fragile when not balanced by respect, transparency, and accountability, and that lessons of hubris and consequence are often the sharpest teachers. And as the seasons changed, on my land, with spring bringing growth to the areas I had begun restoring, and summer illuminating the beauty of the open spaces still intact, I felt a renewed connection to the place. A sense that it was no longer just a battleground, but a living, breathing part of my life that had endured the storm and would continue to evolve with care and intention. And I began to take deliberate steps to shape the community around me, advocating for responsible oversight, supporting neighbors in understanding their rights, and quietly mentoring those who faced similar conflicts, because the battle had shown me that knowledge and preparation were as vital as courage, and that standing firm in the face of unfairness could create ripple effects far beyond one person or one property. And even in moments of solitude, when I sat under the shade of an old tree that had survived the construction, I contemplated the emotional journey, the highs of vindication and the lows of despair, and I realized that the true victory had been not only in reclaiming land, but in discovering the resilience, patience, and strategic insight I carried within myself, and that these qualities, tempered through adversity, were more valuable than any court ruling, because they could guide me through every future challenge, every confrontation, and every unexpected obstacle that life might place in my path. And as I looked across the landscape, feeling the sun warm my face and the wind carry the scents of grass and earth, I understood that while the scars of conflict remained, they were also reminders of endurance and triumph, proof that even in the most intense and personal battles, clarity of purpose and careful action could transform despair into opportunity. And I thought about the legacy I wanted to leave, not only in terms of property, but in terms of the example of persistence, courage, and intelligent planning, and how these lessons might inspire others to stand firm, to observe, to act patiently, and to never underestimate their own ability to reclaim control over circumstances that at first seem overwhelming. And as evening descended, casting golden light over the partially built homes and the stretches of land that were still mine to nurture, I felt a profound sense of completion and peace, knowing that the struggle had changed me forever, that the land, the neighbors, and the story of the HOA conflict would live on as both cautionary tale and inspiration, and that I had emerged not just victorious, but wiser, more grounded, and fully aware that the power of patience, preparation, and unwavering resolve can turn even the most desperate situations into lasting triumphs that shape life, community, and personal legacy in ways that endure far beyond a single conflict or a single court ruling.